Hello everyone, welcome back to TL Education. Today we will be continuing on our previous video on psychology, chapter 1, introduction to psychology. Today we will be covering chapter 2, sensation and perception. We will be defining the terms of sensation and perception, the forms of sensation and perception, and vice versa. And so let's get right into it. What is sensation? So sensation is the process whereby a stimulation of a respiratory cell such as eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and our surface skin sends nerve impulses to the brain. So sensations are closely tied to what is happening in the sensory system of this on themselves. Color, brightness, and the pitch of tone, or a taste, a bitter taste, are example of sensation. The starting point of sensation is stimulus, a form of energy such as light waves and sound waves that can affect sensory organs such as eyes and or ears. Sensation is therefore the process that detects a stimulus from one's body or from the environment. So when we come to what is perception, a perception is instead of a simple sensation, a perceptual process are constantly at work to modify sensory input into what are actually experienced perception. Uh, Perception is the process that organizes a sensation into a meaningful pattern. So, as we said, a sensation is what is gathered by our respiratory cells such as eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, and our surface skin. So that information that is gathered will be perceived, or by the process of perception it will be organized into a meaningful pattern. For example, you are now looking at these bold forms of letters. These are uh, coming into your brain through your eyes, right? These have no meaning. They are just stimulus of sourced by your eyes. So these letters are just non-meaningless. So by the process of perception, which perception is, it will recognize these letters into a meaningful things. As I am doing right now, I am looking at these letters and I am reading them. So looking at them is the sensation, and taking them and interpreting them into a meaningful pattern, which are words, that is perception. Thus, hearing sounds and seeing colors is largely a sensory process, but forming a melody and detecting patterns and shapes is largely a perceptual process. So, um, let's make. I'm going to try to make this a little bit shorter because we are going to be covering a lot of this. So, let's get to the sensory laws. So there are two sensory laws, the basic sensory laws. These are sensory threshold and sensory adaptation. So what we mean with sensory threshold is the minimum point of intensity a sound can be detected. So the minimum point of intensity that a sound can be detected. Therefore, there are two laws of sensory threshold: the law of the absolute threshold and the law of difference threshold. So the absolute threshold states that the minimum amount of stimulus a person can detect is called an absolute threshold. Or for example, a cup of coffee would require a certain amount of sugar before you could detect a sweet taste. So that minimum amount of stimulus or the minimum amount of sugar is called the absolute threshold. So because the absolute threshold for a particular sensory experience varies, psychologists operationally define the absolute threshold as a minimum level of stimulation that can be detected 50% of the time when a stimulus is presented over and over again. Thus, if you were presented with a low intensity of sound of 30 times and detected a 15 times, the level of intensity would be your absolute threshold for that stimulus. When we get into the difference threshold, one of the type of the one of the type of the sensory threshold. We have sensory threshold, which is divided into absolute threshold and difference threshold. The difference threshold is what is added to be detect a change in the intensity of the minimum stimulus. So in addition to detecting the presence of stimulus, you also detect change in the intensity of the stimulus. So what is different about the difference threshold is basically what can make a change in that stimulus. So the minimum amount of change that can be detected in a stimulus is called the difference threshold. For example, a cup of coffee would require a certain amount of additional sugar before you could detect an increase in sweetness. So that additional sugar is a change in the increase in sweetness. So that is called a difference threshold. Similarly, you would have to increase the intensity of the sound from your tape recorder a certain amount before you could detect a change in its volume. So that change is called a difference threshold. Like the absolute threshold, the difference threshold for a particular sensory experience varies from person to person and from occasion to occasion. Therefore, psychologists formally define the difference threshold as a minimum change in stimulation that can be detected 50% of the time by the given person, which is called the just noticeable difference, or the JND. The amount of change in intensity of stimulation needed to produce just noticeable difference is a constant fraction of the original stimulus, which is this known as the Weber's law. For example, because the just noticeable difference for a weight of 2% and you held a 50 ounce of weight, you would notice a change only if there was at least 1 ounce change in it. The next thing about the sensory is we stated that sensory laws are sensory threshold and sensory adaptation. So let's cover what is sensory adaptation. A sensory adaptation is becoming adapt to a change till you don't notice that there is a change. One possible reason is that if the stimulus remains constant in intensity, you will gradually stop noticing it. For example, after diving into a swimming pool, you might shiver, yet a few minutes later you might not. Or you might even invite someone to join into the swim, that considering that it's not shivering. Or when entering your friend's dormitory room, you might be struck by the repugnant stink of the months-old garbage, yet a few minutes later you might not notice the odor at all. This is the tendency to sensory repository to have decreasing responsiveness to unchanging stimulus, which is called a sensory adaptation. So if your room stinks and there's a lot of garbage and a mess, it might stink in the first place, but if you have not cleaned it and you kept going on with the stink and the garbage, you might not notice it at all, that your dormitory or your room stinks, until a person from the outside comes in and notices it. But you have adapted to that scent, that it is not a repentant to you. So that is called what is a sensory adaptation. So a sensory adaptation lets you detect potentially important change in your environment while ignoring unchanging aspects of it. For example, when a vibration repeatedly stimulates your skin and you stop noticing them. Thus, if you were having a bumpy train ride that made your seat vibrate against your bottom, you would initially notice the vibration, but it would serve little purpose for you to continue noticing them. Likewise, once you have determined that the swimming pool water is cold or that your friend's room smells, it would serve little purpose to continue noticing them, those stimuli, especially when your more important change might be taking place elsewhere in your surroundings. So this is basically what is called an adaptive, because to ignore such stimuli might be harm or fatal. So let's get back to what is about more about perceptions. Perception. So we have seen the earlier that perception is making meaning through the process of what is gained by stimulation or sensory, right? So now you study more about this meaning making process of human intelligent life. So selective perception. So let's call, as the name implies, selective perception or attention is basically we all cannot focus on everything that is happening around us. For example, on this video, you might be sitting down in a library or in a public place. There are a lot of things that could be going on in your environment at this point, but your mind chose to focus on this video or on my voice, on what I'm saying, because of the selective of perception or an attention. So that's what basically means selectiveness of perception or attention. So note that any given time your sense organ is bombarded by many stimuli, yet you perceive a few of them, where you are aware of, for example, the noise in your room until you read the sentence. You may not yet input from the environment was coming into your ears all the time. So also there are main concepts in the selective perception implies, among other things, that our field of experience divided into focus and margin. So the difference in focus and margin is focus is basically what you meaningfully focus on. For example, you are meaningfully focusing on my voice throughout this lecture, but at time to time, your environment, throughout your environment, you're not focusing on. There might be people talking, people walking, but you're not focusing on that. But it is still happening, and you are still aware of it subconsciously. So that is called what is called a margin. So events or stimuli that perceive clearly are those focus of your experience, and other items or stimuli that you perceive dimly or vaguely which are margin. So to illustrate focus and margin, consider that you are perceptual field in a football game. While you are dimly aware of the tangle of players and the activity of the blockers during the play, it is the ball carrier that his movement that stands out clearly to your attention, which is called your focus. But at the same time, sensory inputs are coming in from your cold feet, from your stomach, and the result of last uncomfortable food you ate, or vice versa. So the crowd cheering, these are all margins, but which you are focusing on could be your focus could be on the play or on the game. But when the game has stopped, you can go back to your margins, which your margins could now be your focus, and you will be aware of your cold feet, your stomach ache, and the crowd cheering and everything. That will be good. So what it says over here is basically is that attention could constantly shift. So it could shift from margin to focus and from focus to margin. So when your focus was first on the game, but the game was on halftime, now you are going back to your margins and making them your focus by noticing that your cold feet and your stomach ache and the crowd cheering, the loud crowd and everything. But when the game starts again, you will go back to your focus, which is the actual game that you've been focusing on. So let's talk about a little bit about repetition. Repetition is the second factor that you may more likely to attend to stimuli that repeatedly or frequently occur in your perceptual field. So a misspelled word is more likely to be detected if it occurs many times in a paragraph than when it occurs only once or twice. You are going to notice a person if he is continuously follows you as compared to a person you met only once or twice. So in a word, repetition is also attention getting. However, no matter how big or bright a stimulus is, or else no matter how frequently it may occur, you may not be giving attention as if it occurs the same way all the time. This is basically because you are likely to adapt to it, because as we have said previously, the sensory adaptation, uh, you are more likely to adapt to it and then stop responding to it. This is called the sensory adaptation or habitation. So, in general, stimulus in the environment that are bigger and brighter are frequently occurring, or newer or moving are more likely to get your attention. Paying attention is not, however, determined only by these characteristics of objects. Even when stimulus is bigger, brighter, new, frequent, or moving, you may not give it attention if you are not psychologically ready to attend to it. Hence, attention giving also depends on the psychological states of an observer. So there are so the psychologists have identified two important psychological factors, which are sets and expectancies and motives and needs. So sets refers to the idea that you may be ready and primed for a certain kind of sensory input. So, for example, a person or a husband could be waiting for a call, so he's primed and ready. Sensitive organ is his ear, trying to hear the phone call. So he's expecting for the phone call, while his wife could be her sensory organ that is ready is her ear, but it is for a different reason. It might be to hear her child cry, so she could respond to it very quickly. So this is so the psychologists identified these two important factors, psychological factors, which this one is the set and expectancy. So you are expecting, or you have set your mind for a something. So that is what it means by sets and expectancies. So when we come to motives and needs, are the second psychological factors influencing you as an observer. There are differences between you and your friend in what you select to perceive as a result of difference in your motives and needs. You are and your friend attend to and organize the sensory input in ways that match your respective needs. So this is not about what a person is focusing on, or trying to focus, or trying to prime himself to a certain thing like sets and expectancies, but this one is all about what the person needs or what the person's motives is. So in his personality, he is more likely to respond to a certain thing than a certain other thing. So this is all about the person himself, his motives and his needs that can make him to be different from other people. So, form of perception. So there are multiple forms of perceptions. We will be covering them. So visual sensation are discussed under sensation, provided the raw material that are being organized into a meaningful pattern, shapes, forms, and concept and ideas on form of perception. So we need to distinguish a figure, an object, from its ground, so which is called figure ground perception, which is one of the form of perception. So the figure ground perception is the perception of an object or and a form of everyday experience as standing out from background. So picture hang on a wall, which the picture is the figure and the wall is the ground. So figure ground perception. So if there is a picture on the wall, the picture can be our figure and the ground can be our wall, which we will be separating from what is our figure, which we are focusing on, and what is we are not focusing on, which is our ground or the wall. It also can be words and the page, as we are seeing on our canvas here. We are not focusing on this white area here. We are focusing on what is written, the words on our canvas right here. So it could also be a melody that stands out for the repeated chords in the musical background, and vice versa. So the ability to distinguish an object in its general background is the basics to all forms of perception. And also, but the Gestalt psychologists stress that form of perception is active rather than passive process, like selective of perception. Hence, can be a shift in perception of figure and ground, such that a figure may become a ground, and a ground might become a figure as well. So, what the Gestalt psychologists are saying here is, if we are, it is not likely, but if we are looking at a figure or an image hanging on a wall, they are saying that the image might not be the figure, but the background could be our figure, and the one called the figure or the picture could be our background, and vice versa. So, what are contours? So, contours in form of perception. So, you are able to separate forms from general ground only because you can perceive contours. So contours are formed whenever a marked difference occurs in the brightness or color of the background. So contours are all about brightness and colors of background. So contours are basically the marked differences based on brightness and color of background. If you, for instance, look at a piece of paper that varies continuously in brightness from white at one border to black and opposite to at an opposite border, you will perceive no contour because there is a shade that you might not be able to figure out where the specific point that there is a change at. So the paper will appear uniform, and if you are asked to say where the sheet stops being light and starts being dark, you can only guess. On the other hand, if the change is marked rather than gradually, suppose several shades are skipped you will see the paper as divided into two parts, which is the black and the white. So in perceiving the division at the place where the brightness gradient change abruptly, you have perceived a contour. In general, contour gives shape to the objects in your visual world because they mark one objective form of another, or they mark an object of form of the general ground. There is also the organization in form of perception. When several objects are present in visual field, we tend to perceive them as organized into patterns or groups. So, organizational form of perception is all about organized into patterns and groups. So, the previous one, contours, were based on the brightness and colors, while organization is based on patterns and groups. Though the Gestalt psychology studied such organization intensively in early parts of this country, they emphasized that organized perceptual experience has properties which cannot be predicted from a simple analysis of the components. In other words, the Gestalt psychology said the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So this simply means that it is perceived has its own new properties that emerge from organization which takes place. Organization in perception partially explains our perception of complex patterns as unitary forms or objects. So basically, if you know that images are made of pixels, so if we see a single pixel, we might not see anything or make any sense out of a single pixel. But if we see a whole pixel of we take a picture at 300 pixels and a lot of things, when we see a whole picture, we can identify that picture as being a person or as being a landscape photo shoot of a landscape and everything. So it's all about the perception in making an organization through could be images and a lot of things. So one organizing principle in proximity or nearness, the laws of proximity says the items which are close together in space or time tend to be perceived as belonging together or forming an organized group. Another organizing principle could be similarity. So most people see one triangle formed by dots with its apex at the top of another triangle formed by the rings with its apex at the bottom. They perceive triangles because similar items such as the rings and the dots tend to be organized together. Otherwise, they would see a hexagon or a six-pointed star where all that their dots are the same. There's also the concept of good figure. So the law of good figure says that there is a tendency to organize things to make balanced or symmetric figure that includes all parts. In this case, such balanced figure can be achieved only by using all the dots and rings to perceive six-pointed star. But the law of good figure wins out over the law of similarity because the rings by themselves or dots by themselves do not form a symmetric good figure. The next thing we're going to be discussing is depth perception. So when we say depth perception is by sight, we can figure out depth. So what is near could appear big, what is far could appear small. So if we live in a two-dimensional world, from perception we would be sufficient, but because we live in a three-dimensional world, we have involved depth perception, the ability to judge the distance of an object. Given that image or retina are two-dimensional, how can we perceive depth? So this is how can we determine the distance of objects. So the distal stimulus from the patterns of stimulation or retinals of proximal stimulus. So depth perception depends on the use of bicular cues and monocular cues. So there are two types of bicular cues, which are the retinal disparity and the convergence. So the retinal disparity is the degree of difference between the image of an object that focused on the two retinas. The closer the object, the greater its retinal disparity. To demonstrate retinal disparity for yourself, point our finger vertically between our eyes and look at the finger with one eye closed and change your eye, look at it with the other closed then. So every time there will be a shift as we view the scene with different views as the same stimulus. So there will be a change in the background. So the ViewMaster device you might have used as a child to create the impression of visual depth by presenting slightly different image to the eyes at the same time mimicking retinal disparity. So the next one is convergence, which is the binocular cues, which is convergence and retinal disparity. Convergence is the degree to which the eye turns inward to focus on an object. So as you can confirm for yourself, the closer the object are the greater the convergence of the eyes. So as we said, convergence means which the eyes turn inward to focus on an object. So if you point your finger and throw it towards your nose, your eyes can converge towards each other to focus on that finger that is coming towards your nose. So, for example, drinking alcohol impairs depth perception by disrupting the normal convergence of eyes, and using computer terminal for hours induce eye fatigue caused by continuous convergence. So, we've seen the binocular cues, which require two eyes, whereas monocular cues requires only one eye. This means that even people who have lost one sight in one eye may still have good depth perception, while one monocular is accommodation. So one of the monocular cue is accommodation, which is the change in the shape of the lens that lets you focus the image of an object on the retina. So neuron in the rectum assumes that the greater the accommodation of lens, the closer the objects. But prolonged accommodation can alter the depth of perception. For example, if you stare at a near object for a long time and then look at a far distant object, the more distant object will look farther away than it is. This is attributable to the brain overcompensation for the continuous accumulation of the lens while it was focused on a near object. The second molecular cue is the motion parallax. The tendency to perceive ourselves as passing objects is faster when they are closer to us than when they are further away. You will notice this when you drive a rural road. You perceive yourself passing nearby telephone poles faster than you are passing a farmhouse. It's all about the perception. So the remaining molecular cue is a pictorial cue. Um, the pictorial cue, because the artists used them to create depth in their drawing and paintings. Leonardo da Vinci formalized a pictorial cue in 500 years ago in teaching his art students how to use them to make their painting look more realistic. He noted that an object that overlaps another object will appear closer, and a cue called interposition, because the psychology professor overlaps the backboard. You know that he or she is closer to you than the backboard. So comparing the relative size of an object also provide a cue to their distance. If two people are about to the same height and one casts a smaller image on the retina. A pictorial cue, there is also a linear perspective, which may even have a practical application. And an object's elevations provides another cue to its distance. Objects that are higher in your visual field seem to be farther away. If you paint a picture, you create depth by placing more distant objects higher on the canvas. And there are also shading patterns which provide cues to distance, because areas that are in shadow tends to recede while areas that are in light tends to stand out. Painters use shading to make balls, balloons, organs appear around. Aerial perspective depends on the clarity of objects. Closer objects seem clearer than more distant ones. A distant mountain will look hazy. So our next concept is the perceptual consistency. The image of a given object focused on your retina may vary in size, shape, and brightness. So yet you will continue to perceive the object as stable in size, shape, and brightness, because the perceptual constancy. This is adaptive because it provides you with a more visual stable world, making it easier for you to function in it. As an object gets further away from you, it produces a smaller image in your retina. If you know the actual size of an object, size constancy makes you interpret a change in its retinal size as a change in its distance rather than the change in its size. So it's basically being adapted and recognizing the change in your sights. So if you know a general size of a human being, you will recognize that when a person goes far away from you, it tends to be smaller in size as farther as it goes, but that does not make that person smaller in real life or smaller when it's right next to you. So by using size constancy, you will recognize that the form of thing that is happening by the size change. So when you see a car block away, it does not seem smaller than one that is half a block away, even though the more distant car produces a smaller image on your retina size. Size consistency can be distributed by alcohol as well. In one study, young adults drank alcohol and were then asked to estimate the size of an object. They tended to estimate its size. Disruption of size consistency might be one way alcohol intoxication promotes automobile accidents. So there is also a shape consistency, as we said before, assures that an object of a known shape will appear to maintain its normal shape regardless of an angle from which you view it. Uh, there is also brightness consistency, which through the amount of light reflected from a given object can vary. We perceive the object as having a constant brightness, which is called a brightness constancy. Uh, there's also perceptual illusion, which, as the name implies, making a perceptual illusion of what is there or what is not there, as making an interpretation or making an illusion to making it appear. So, um, visual illusion provides clues to the process involved in normal visual perception. So, for example, from ancient times to modern time, people have been mis people have been mystified by the moon illusion, illustrated in figure in which the moon appears large when it is in the horizon than when it is overhead. This is an illusion because the moon is the same distance from us at the horizon as when it is overhead. Thus, the retinal image it produces is the same size when it is at the horizon and it is overhead. Thus, the retinal image it produces is the same size when it's so. Though no explanation has achieved universal acceptance in favor, one relies on size constancy, and resemblance of the figure on the right in the inside corner of a room, and resemblance of the figure on the left on the outside corner of the buildings. So this is basically it on the chapter 2 that we have covered on sensory and perception. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and share to your fellow friends, and check out chapter 1 in psychology introduction to psychology, and keep tuned to our next episode on psychology on chapter 3, which we will be covering human development, I guess. Let me see. No, human development is chapter 4. So chapter 3 is learning and theories of learning. So thank you.